And let's start with NIL discussion. I think that has some effect on some of the transfers and recruits. And we always go with our tweets of the week to begin with. So this first one here, Jim, you had a really good, back on, I think it was April 30th, you had a really good thread you put together. It was about Nebraska landed the number one portal player at a position of need coming off a 3-9 season. How did they do it? How does Nebraska play in this new game of NIL? Who else can play? What do fans think? What happens? And then a thread. And it was a really great thread. Maybe explain a little bit about what you went over in that thread, and then we'll have that discussion.
Yeah, so it's based around a book that I recommend to all of our audience out there called Finite and Infinite Games. And it's a good book for life, for business, for your career. It's about being involved in games that have an ending or don't have an ending. So finite, infinite games. But I'm really fascinated by it to see what schools, what programs decide to get involved in this game. We saw the blow up. I was at a few days ago over the weekend with Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher. I mean, these guys are heavily involved in this NIL game at a high level. I mean, these are elite schools competing for elite players. But how do the rest of these programs figure out their space and their path in this new undefined game? There's no barriers. There's very little rules, and we'll get into that in a second. But I'm fascinated to see how, Nebraska, like a lot of things, has decided to go first and decided to, we don't know exactly how this is going to happen. We're going to dive in and get involved. And that was Trev Albert's very first kind of public statement about that. And we've seen Nebraska get involved in this game and get involved pretty aggressively. And so the thread was more about just, one, obviously getting O'Shawn Mathis was a big deal. And I don't think NIL was the sole reason why we got O'Shawn Mathis, but definitely played a part. I think we can all agree to that. But I went through and just kind of chronologically just talked about different schools, Iowa State, Purdue, that have flat out said, we're not getting involved. We're kind of going to sit back and we're going to watch this thing take place. We're going to kind of see how this goes. We're going to be grounded in our own culture and our own foundational pieces that work well for us. And, they can't blame them for that kind of mindset, at least out of the gates. And so, but Nebraska's not that way. And we're kind of seeing them shoot out of the gate with a pretty aggressive mindset. And so it was kind of just discussion around the game, if you will, and how people are playing the game. And it's to me, it's kind of fascinating to see who's playing it and who's not, and what they're learning, things that have happened, and ultimately how it's going to end up is going to be really interesting. So that was kind of the basis for the thread.
Mm-hmm. We talked with Tom Osborne a couple of weeks ago on the show, and we had mentioned NIL with him and transfer portal and all that. And, obviously he shares concerns as an old school guy. He shares concerns of what this is doing to the game and will fans come along with it. I think, our perspective on the Redcast has always been, whether we agree with it or not, at the very least, you either play the game with the rules that are in place right now, or you risk falling behind. And I think you make a good point there, Jim, with some of the schools that aren't playing it. There's this assumption that just what Nebraska's doing right now, everyone's doing, and they're not. And I want to bring back up those tweets here because, Dave, what you did with Husk Guys, and we couldn't say anything for a long time. We have a great thread going between Dave and Jim and I on Twitter. And we knew for a couple of months that you were kind of putting together this collective with ABM. And I kind of want you to explain a little bit of what that is too, because I think some of the Redcasters listening, there's some misinformation sometimes out there. What is a collective? What is allowed? What's not allowed? This feels dirty, but I mean, you've set up something that's through the rules. It's through ABM, which is Garrett Lambright's company that works with some of the players and makes sure that everything is going the right way. And so can you kind of explain what that collective is and how people can contribute to it as well?
Yeah, happy to. And it goes back, I've sort of been fascinated the same way Jim has, and you have been as well, of like what direction is NIL going to go? And I've sort of been obsessively following as everything's been unfolding. And I have a text thread with a bunch of buddies from high school, and we're 24/7 on the Huskers, and I'll give them a shout out. So Zach Lubeck and Chuck Hall and Alex Post, and we're constantly going at it. And I would say like 9 months ago, before the collectives were pretty popular, we saw the Gator Collective pop up. So I would say that was probably the first one. Florida had started a collective, which is a fan-driven collective. And I think as you think of NIL, the popular things that everybody was immediately thinking of are, the big boosters that are going to come in and donate, quite a bit of money. And then the big corporate sponsorships and the car dealerships and those sorts of things, which, obviously are going to exist. But what was interesting to me about the Gator Collective is they were the first ones that I had seen that brought in fan support. And they allowed fans to contribute to these broader collectives at $1, $5, $10, $20 increments. And so, this buddies of mine and my brother as well started working through like, what would this look like if we did this for Nebraska? And we started to wireframe out what a strategy would look like. How do we put this together? How do we start to, how much capital do we need? How much capital do we want to raise? How do we build out a website? And we started networking within, the Nebraska community, see if anybody was doing this already. And a lot of the signs, and the folks who we had met with pointed us toward Jared Lambrecht, who is at the Athlete Branding and Marketing, had just launched his, I think he's a little more than a year in business for his agency. And he had been previously the chief of staff for Scott Frost. So he had all the direct relationships with the players. And so that was a huge piece of it, where he had working directly with the players, almost all of the players on the football team, as well as volleyball team and baseball team and a few of the other sports, that, he had those relationships that were running through the sponsorship side. And so he had some similar ideas to launch a fan-driven collective. And so we thought it would be best, as opposed to launching something separate, to join forces. And so for this component, I think it's the first iteration of trying to draw fan support for it is, you're able to contribute and become a member of, the website you put up there, n100husker.com, get access to gear, memorabilia, videos, interviews, video chats, events. And the idea, and really what we saw, like the gap in the marketplace, is it wasn't just like the sponsors and, the corporate and the big boosters, but as I looked particularly, like, where could we help, right? Like with that bias for action, how can Husker fans contribute? We have over 50,000 followers across a variety of different accounts, that if you start to add in $10 a month across, 50,000 plus followers, plus everything that you guys have across the broader network, that adds up to, $3, $4, $5 million on an annual basis. And if you read about where NIL is going, the big war chest that folks are building up, you read about Texas and A&M and what Jimbo is going off on, they're talking about $10, $15, $20 million in annual operating, capital that they're looking for. So I saw it as an interesting opportunity to bring in the big competitive advantage that Nebraska has is fan support. And I think as you look at some of the transfer portal stuff, I think everybody immediately goes towards like the dollars of like, there's a dollars component to it. But I think what it is a bigger signal in the recruiting side is you got Husker fans are going to sell out the stadium. You've got every local business in Lincoln, as well as broader Nebraska, wants to help and be genuinely a part of these kids' lives. And then the fans too are contributing too. And I think they feel that momentum. They feel the articles. They feel a lot of the stuff that's going on. So I think, a lot of people look at it as like, oh, it's free agency. But I guess where I see it is they see it as like, wow, this whole state is behind you in so many different ways. And I think that's what you're starting to see in the transfer portal is I think the players are seeing that.
Well, Jim, you had mentioned O'Shawn Mathis, and what's interesting is so many of the things that he talked about and his mother talked about from the recruitment standpoint were very traditional, old school recruiting tactics and things that, the honesty that obviously Frost brought to him, and she highlighted that. And so it's still, you still have to be good at those old school things. And yet the NIL is one supplemental way, one of many ways to bring these kids under the rules of today now.
Yeah, I think we forget, like sometimes we think about, it's going to be so easy, right? We're going to be offered this much money to go to Tennessee or this place or that place. You're just talking about somebody having to move their life, right? O'Shawn Mathis is from the Dallas or from the Austin area, right? He's going to have to move from Austin to Nebraska. So we can talk about the different things that are involved in NIL, but at the end of the day, it's still someone, actually a human being, a kid in college, right? Moving his life someplace else. So in O'Shawn Mathis' situation, I was impressed with the methodical work they did, him and his family, in, vetting out Nebraska. I mean, they went down to the body language of players to the coaches. This was a business move for him. He wants to be here 1 year, or, at the most 2 years, right? But at the end of the day, it's more than just, what opportunities do I have in NIL? It's do I get along with my teammates? Am I going to fit in Lincoln, Nebraska? Am I going to respond to Coach Dawson the way I want to be coached, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, these are all things that him and his family really, I thought, did a good job of vetting out. And obviously, NIL plays a part in that, but it's not going to be the end-all, be-all. I think we have to remember that as Nebraska fans, as we get into this conversation about, transfers coming in, the amount of transfers coming in, and they're doing some homework too, right? It's not going to be just move here and voila, things happen for me, right? There's obviously homework involved, and there's a lot of making sure this is still a good fit. I mean, we're still in the middle of the country. I mean, this is still a small population state. So I think we get all caught up sometimes too much, and it's just going to be so simple, and it's just going to be, it's this money grab here. People are going to move left and right here and there. There's more involved in that, I think, than just what we see on the surface.
Yeah. And, Jim, some of the fit that you're talking about is, strategically the X's and O's fit. Right now, there's changes potentially on both sides of the ball. If you're a receiver, if you're someone coming in on the offensive side, are we going under center more? You've heard more about the power run game. If you're a defender like O'Shawn or Drew or Wynn now, are we running 4-3? Are we running 3-4? I mean, these are things that, you're not just jumping just because someone's giving you an NIL deal. You want to make sure you understand what the fit is, what's the scheme going to look like. And I'm not convinced, and we can get to this a little later when we talk roster. I'm not convinced that we're going to see all the same scheme that we just saw in the spring. I mean, I think there's going to be some evolutions on both sides of the ball. And a lot of the transfers that have been brought in, the one thing where I will call them free agents is that the expectation is that these guys in most cases are going to come in and provide pretty ready depth in some fashion, whether they're starters or they're, right off the second string, whatever it is, there's going to be some immediate contributions from them. So, and they can help, change us if we are going into a little bit different, X's and O's kind of setup.